The blizzard hit with a vengeance that February morning in 1883, transforming the Montana Territory into a white hell that swallowed everything in its path. And Dalton Wade knew if he did not find shelter soon, he would become just another frozen corpse that spring would eventually reveal. His horse struggled through drifts that reached past its knees, breath coming in desperate puffs of steam, but Dalton pressed on toward his ranch, squinting against the needles of ice that struck his face like tiny daggers. The wind howled with such fury that he almost missed the dark shape lying half buried in the snow near the tree line, and when he finally registered what he was seeing, his heart lurched in his chest because no one should be out here, not in this, not alone. He dismounted quickly, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder, and stumbled toward the figure. A woman lay face down, her dark hair spread across the white canvas like spilled ink, her body already dusted with a fresh layer of snow that suggested she had been here long enough to be in serious danger. Dalton dropped to his knees beside her, his gloved hand searching for a pulse at her neck, and relief flooded through him when he felt the faint flutter of life beneath his fingertips. She wore a thin traveling dress completely inadequate for this weather. No coat, no proper boots, just the kind of clothes someone might wear on a mild autumn day, and he wondered what series of catastrophes had led her to this moment. There was no time for questions. Dalton scooped her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile, and he secured her across his saddle before climbing up behind her, holding her against his chest as he urged his horse forward through the storm. His ranch was still 2 miles away, but it might as well have been 20 in these conditions. The mare struggled valiantly, and Dalton kept his head low, his arms wrapped around the unconscious woman, sharing what little warmth his body could provide. The ride felt endless, each minute stretching into an eternity of white and wind and cold that seeped into his bones despite his heavy coat and layered clothing. He talked to his horse, encouraged her, promised her warm oats and a rubdown when they made it home, and he talked to the woman too, though she could not hear him, telling her to hold on, that she was going to be all right, that he would not let her die out here in this God-forsaken cold. When the dark shape of his cabin finally emerged from the swirling snow, Dalton wanted to weep with relief. He guided his mare to the small barn attached to the side of the structure, dismounted with the woman still in his arms, and kicked the door open. Inside, the temperature was not much better, but at least they were out of the wind. He laid the woman on a pile of hay, then quickly unsaddled his horse and rubbed her down with shaking hands, giving her feed and water before covering her with a blanket. The mare had saved both their lives today. Dalton gathered the woman into his arms again and carried her through the connecting door into his cabin. The fire had died down to embers, but the interior was still warmer than outside. He laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the single-room cabin, and immediately went to work building up the fire. His hands trembled as he added kindling and logs, coaxing flames to life, and soon blessed heat began to fill the space. He returned to the woman and began the delicate work of removing her wet clothes. Her skin was ice cold, lips tinged blue, and he worked quickly but carefully, mindful of her modesty even as he understood that leaving her in these frozen garments would kill her. He found one of his own shirts and a pair of his smaller underthings, managing to dress her in them before wrapping her in every blanket and quilt he owned. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to restore circulation, watching for any signs of frostbite. Her face was beautiful even in its pallor, with high cheekbones and full lips, dark lashes resting against her cheeks. She looked young, perhaps in her early 20s, and Dalton found himself wondering about her story, about who she was and where she had come from. But those questions would have to wait. For now, he focused on keeping her alive. He heated water and filled several bottles, tucking them around her body to help raise her core temperature. He made broth from dried beef and vegetables, keeping it warm on the stove in case she woke and could take some nourishment. Then he settled into his chair beside the bed and waited, listening to her shallow breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. Night fell early as it always did in winter, and the storm continued to rage outside, rattling the shutters and howling down the chimney. Dalton dozed fitfully in his chair, jerking awake periodically to check on his patient, to add wood to the fire, to ensure she was still breathing. Somewhere around midnight, her color began to improve, the blue fading from her lips, a hint of pink returning to her cheeks. Dawn brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the wind had intensified and snow piled high against the cabin walls. Dalton heated more broth and checked his supplies, calculating how long they could last if the blizzard continued. He had enough firewood for a week, maybe longer if he was careful. Food would be fine. He always kept his larder well stocked for situations exactly like this. He was stirring the broth when he heard a soft sound from the bed. He turned to find the woman's eyes open, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling beams with obvious confusion. Her eyes were green, he noticed, a deep forest green that seemed to catch the firelight. "Easy now," he said, moving to her side. "You are safe." She turned her head toward him, those green eyes widening with fear. She tried to sit up, but her body would not cooperate, weakened by her ordeal. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "My ranch." About 15 miles north of Julian, Montana territory. He kept his voice gentle, non-threatening. "I found you in the snow yesterday morning. You were nearly frozen." She closed her eyes and he saw tears begin to leak from the corners. "I thought I was going to die." "You almost did." He pulled his chair closer. "What is your name?" "Sarah Reynolds." She opened her eyes again, looking at him with new interest. "Who are you?" "Dalton Wade. This is my place." He gestured around the modest cabin. "It is not much, but it is warm and dry. You are welcome to stay as long as you need." "I do not remember much," she said, her brow furrowing. "The stage. There was an accident. The wheel broke and we went over down an embankment. Everyone was screaming." Her breathing quickened as the memory returned. "The driver, he was thrown clear. I think his neck broke. The other passengers, there was so much blood. A woman named Mrs. Patterson, she was not moving. And a young man, a salesman, he was trapped under the luggage." "Where were you headed?" Dalton asked. "Virginia City. I was supposed to meet my cousin there. She runs a boarding house and offered me work." Sarah's voice cracked. "I left everything behind in Ohio after my parents died. The farm was sold to pay debts. I had nothing left there." Dalton felt a surge of sympathy for this woman who had already lost so much and then nearly lost her life in the snow. "How did you get separated from the stage?" "I was not hurt badly in the crash, just bruised. I tried to help the others, but there was nothing I could do." The salesman was still alive, barely. "He told me to go for help. There was supposed to be a way station a few miles back. I started walking." She closed her eyes again. "It was so cold. The snow started falling harder. I could not see. I just kept walking until I could not walk anymore." "You walked in the wrong direction," Dalton said quietly. "The way station is south. You went north." "I got turned around in the snow," she whispered. "I killed them, did I not, if I had found help faster?" "You did not kill anyone," Dalton said firmly. "You did what you could. You tried. That is more than many people would have done." She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in his weathered face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of long days in the sun, the dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, the broad shoulders and capable hands. He was perhaps 30, she guessed, old enough to have some years on him but still in his prime. There was kindness in his eyes, and she found herself trusting him instinctively. "Thank you," she said, "for saving me, for bringing me here. You could have ridden past and never seen me." "I could never have done that," he replied. "No decent person could. Not everyone is decent." "That is true enough." He stood. "Are you hungry? I have broth. It will help warm you from the inside." She nodded, and he brought her a mug of the steaming liquid. She managed to sit up enough to sip it, and he saw her wince as she moved. "Sore?" he asked. "Everything hurts," she admitted, "but I suppose that means I am alive to feel it." That is the right way to look at it. He watched her drink, noting the way her hands shook slightly. She was still recovering, still weak. It would be days before she was back to full strength. Over the next 3 days, the blizzard continued to pound the Montana territory with relentless fury. Snow piled so high against the cabin that Dalton had to dig a path just to reach the barn to care for his horse and the 2 cows he kept for milk. Sarah remained in bed, her strength returning slowly but steadily. Dalton tended to her with a gentle competence that surprised him. He had lived alone for 5 years now, ever since his father died and left him the ranch, and he had grown accustomed to his solitary life. But having someone to care for, someone to talk to, awakened something in him he had thought long dormant. They talked during those long storm-bound days. Sarah told him about her childhood in Ohio, about her father's farm and how her mother had loved to grow flowers, about the fever that had taken them both within days of each other just before Christmas. She spoke of her grief and her determination to start fresh somewhere new, to build a life that would have made her parents proud. Dalton shared his own story, though with more reluctance. He had been born in Texas, the only son of a rancher who had decided Montana territory offered better opportunities. They had built this place from nothing, just the 2 of them, working dawn to dusk to clear land, build the cabin and barn, establish a herd. His mother had died when he was young, too young to remember her clearly, and so it had always been just him and his father. Then 5 years ago, his father had been kicked by a spooked horse and died 3 days later from internal injuries. Dalton had been 25 and suddenly alone in the world. "You never get lonely?" Sarah asked on the 3rd day, when she was finally strong enough to sit in the chair by the fire while he worked at repairing a saddle. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I keep busy. There is always work to be done on a ranch, and I go into Julian every few weeks for supplies, see some familiar faces at the general store or saloon." "Have you ever thought about getting married, starting a family?" He looked up from his work, his blue eyes meeting hers. "I thought about it. But ranching is hard work, especially out here where winters can kill you if you are not careful. What woman would want this life?" "One who values security and honesty over luxury," Sarah said. "One who understands that real wealth is not measured in dollars but in the quality of a man's character." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, an acknowledgement of possibility. Dalton felt his heart beat faster, and he had to look away, back down at the leather in his hands. He had known this woman for only 3 days, but already he felt drawn to her in a way he had never experienced before. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was more than that. She had courage. She had endured loss and hardship without becoming bitter. She had tried to save strangers at risk to her own life. These were qualities that mattered, that spoke to the kind of person she was at her core. The storm finally broke on the 4th day. Dalton woke to silence, that particular quality of quiet that comes after days of wind and fury. He rose from his makeshift bed on the floor near the fire and checked on Sarah, who was still sleeping peacefully in his bed. Then he bundled up and went outside. The world had been transformed into a landscape of pure white. Snow covered everything in smooth, undulating drifts that sparkled in the weak morning sunlight. The sky was a pale blue, washed clean by the storm, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. But it was over. They had survived. Dalton spent the morning digging out, creating paths to the barn and to his woodpile, checking on his animals. The horse and cows were fine, if a bit stir-crazy from being cooped up. He mucked out the barn and gave them fresh feed and water, taking his time with the familiar chores. When he returned to the cabin, he found Sarah out of bed and standing by the window, wrapped in one of his quilts, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. She turned when she heard him enter, and he was struck again by her beauty, by the way the morning light caught in her dark hair and made her green eyes glow. "It is beautiful," she said. "I have never seen so much snow." "It is a hard beauty," he replied, stomping snow off his boots. "The kind that can kill you if you do not respect it." "When do you think the road will be passable?" she asked. "When can I continue to Virginia City?" The question hit him like a physical blow, though he tried not to show it. Of course she would want to leave to continue on her journey. She had plans, a destination, a life waiting for her. But the thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its silent emptiness, filled him with an ache he could not quite name. "Hard to say," he answered carefully. "Could be a week or more before anyone can get through. The stage line will need time to clear the route and assess damage, and they will need to send someone to check on that crashed stage to see about those passengers." Sarah's face fell. "I should go with them. I should show them where it happened. Those people deserve proper burial." "They will find it," Dalton assured her. "Once they know a stage went missing, they will search the route. They will find it." He paused. "You cannot blame yourself for what happened. You know that, do not you?" "I know," she said softly, "but knowing and feeling are different things." He understood that more than he could say. He had spent months after his father's death going over every detail, wondering if there was something he could have done differently, some way he could have prevented the accident. Guilt was a heavy burden, even when it was not deserved. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Sarah's strength continued to return, and she insisted on helping around the cabin. She cooked meals while Dalton tended to the outdoor chores. She mended his clothes, which he had to admit were in sad need of attention. She organized his supplies and cleaned every surface until the cabin shone in a way it never had when he lived alone. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk, sharing stories, learning each other's thoughts and opinions on everything from politics to philosophy to the simple pleasure of a good meal. Dalton found himself looking forward to coming back to the cabin each day, knowing she would be there. He loved the way she hummed while she worked, the way she laughed at his dry jokes, the way she listened with genuine interest when he talked about his plans for the ranch. And he could not help but notice the way she looked at him sometimes, with a softness in her eyes that made his breath catch. One evening, about a week after the storm ended, Sarah brought up the subject that had been hovering unspoken between them. They had just finished dinner, and Dalton was whittling a piece of wood while Sarah worked on darning one of his socks. "The road will be clear soon," she said quietly. "I have been here almost 2 weeks now. I should not impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." "You are not imposing," Dalton said, perhaps too quickly. "You are welcome to stay as long as you like." "That is kind of you, but I have obligations. My cousin is expecting me. She is counting on my help with the boarding house." "Have you written to her, to let her know you are alive?" "No, how could I? The mail is not running." "The stage should come through in the next few days," Dalton said. "Once it does, you can send a letter, see what she says. Maybe." He trailed off, not sure how to continue. "Maybe what?" Sarah prompted, setting down her mending to look at him. Dalton put down his whittling and met her eyes. His heart was pounding, but he knew he had to say this, had to take this chance. If he let her leave without speaking his mind, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "Maybe you do not have to go," he said. "Maybe you could stay here, with me." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Sarah's eyes widened and he saw a flash of something in them, surprise, hope, fear, all mixed together. "Dalton," she began, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." He took a deep breath. "I know we have only known each other a short time. I know this is sudden and probably not proper, and I am not doing this the right way. But I feel something for you, Sarah. Something I have never felt for anyone before. When I think about you leaving, about this cabin being empty again, it feels wrong. It feels like losing something precious before I ever really had the chance to appreciate it." "I feel it too," Sarah whispered. "I have been trying not to, trying to tell myself it is just gratitude, just the circumstance of being thrown together. But it is more than that. When you come back from the barn and I hear your footsteps on the porch, my heart lifts. When you smile at something I said, I feel warm all over. When I think about leaving and never seeing you again." She stopped, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Dalton crossed the space between them and knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were small and soft despite the work she had been doing, and they fit perfectly in his larger, calloused ones. "Then stay," he said. "Marry me. Build a life here with me. It will not be easy, I will not lie to you about that. Ranching is hard work and winters are brutal, and there will be times when we wonder if we can make it. But we will have each other. We will face whatever comes together." "You would marry me?" Sarah asked. "A woman you found half frozen in the snow. A woman with nothing to her name, no dowry, no family, no prospects. I would marry you because you are brave and kind and strong," Dalton said. "Because you make me laugh and you make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. Because when I look at you, I see my future and it is brighter than anything I ever imagined for myself." He squeezed her hands gently. "You are not nothing, Sarah Reynolds. You are everything." The tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks, but she was smiling through them. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you, I will stay." Dalton felt a surge of joy so intense it almost frightened him. He stood, pulling her up with him, and wrapped his arms around her. She came willingly, pressing her face against his chest, her arms encircling his waist. They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, feeling the rightness of it, the way they fit together as if they had been designed for this purpose. When Dalton finally pulled back enough to look at her face, he saw his own happiness reflected there. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet, a first kiss full of promise and hope. Sarah's hands came up to rest on his shoulders, and she kissed him back with a tenderness that made his heart ache in the best possible way. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "You are home now," he said softly. "Right here. This is where you belong." "Home," Sarah repeated, testing the word. "Yes, I am home." The first stage after the storm arrived 3 days later. Dalton and Sarah rode into Julian together, her sitting behind him on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist. The town was small, just a collection of buildings clustered around a crossroads, but it served the scattered ranches and mining operations in the area. They stopped first at the general store, where Dalton introduced Sarah to Hiram Tucker, the owner, a portly man with friendly eyes and a ready smile. "Getting married, you say?" Hiram exclaimed, pumping Dalton's hand enthusiastically. "Well, I will be. Congratulations to both of you." "About time you settled down, Wade. This place will be good for you, Miss Reynolds. Dalton here is one of the best men I know." Sarah smiled, warming to the older man immediately. "I am learning that. You will need supplies," Hiram said, already moving behind his counter. "A woman needs more than jerky and beans. No offense, Dalton. Let us get you set up proper." They spent an hour selecting items, everything from bolts of fabric to make curtains and a new dress for Sarah, to cooking supplies, to seeds for a spring garden. Dalton watched Sarah's excitement as she planned for their future, and his heart swelled with love for her. This was real. This was happening. He was going to have a wife, a partner, someone to share his life with. Their next stop was the small church at the edge of town. Reverend Miller was a thin, solemn man in his 50s who had been serving the Julian community for a decade. He listened to their story, his expression softening as Dalton explained how they had met and their decision to marry. "It is irregular," the Reverend said. "The usual practice is to announce the banns, give the community time to object if there is any impediment to the marriage." "There is no impediment," Dalton said firmly. "We are both of age, both free to marry. We want to do this properly, before God and witnesses." The Reverend studied them both, his gaze shrewd. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded. "Very well. I can perform the ceremony this Sunday after regular services. That will give the community a chance to attend and witness the union." "Thank you, Reverend," Sarah said. "That means a great deal to us." They made their way to the land office next, where Dalton filed the necessary paperwork to add Sarah as his legal wife once they were married, ensuring she would have claim to the ranch if anything happened to him. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, copied the information carefully and promised the documents would be ready after the wedding. Their final stop was the small hotel and saloon where they found the sheriff, Tom Bradley, drinking coffee and reviewing reports. Dalton told him about Sarah's ordeal and the crashed stage. "We found it 2 days ago," the sheriff said, his expression grim. "3 dead, just like you said, Miss Reynolds. We brought the bodies back and buried them in the churchyard. Reverend Miller said words over them. The stage company is investigating what caused the wheel to break, whether it was poor maintenance or just bad luck." "Thank you for telling me," Sarah said quietly. "I am glad they were cared for properly." "You did what you could," Sheriff Bradley said. "Most folks would have stayed with the stage and frozen to death. You tried to get help. That took courage." On the ride back to the ranch, Sarah was quiet, processing the news about the stage passengers. Dalton understood her need for silence and simply held the reins steady, letting his horse pick its way along the snow-packed trail. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the snow, creating a landscape that looked like something from a dream. "They had families," Sarah finally said. "The people who died. They were going somewhere to someone, and now they are just gone." "But their families will know what happened," Dalton replied. "They will have closure. That is something, and you get to live, Sarah. You get to build a life and be happy. I think if those people could speak, they would tell you to do exactly that, to not waste the chance you were given." She leaned her cheek against his back. "You always know what to say. Not always, but I try." The days leading up to Sunday passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah worked on making herself a simple but pretty dress from the blue fabric they had purchased. Dalton cleaned and polished his best boots and pressed his one good suit, which he had not worn since his father's funeral. They talked late into the nights, sharing their hopes and fears about the future, learning to communicate honestly and openly with each other. Dalton found himself amazed by how natural it felt to have Sarah in his life, as if she had always been there. She had a quick wit and a practical mind that complemented his own quieter nature. When he mentioned wanting to expand the herd come spring, she immediately began calculating costs and potential profits. When she talked about wanting to plant a large vegetable garden, he offered to build raised beds to make the work easier. They were becoming a team, anticipating each other's needs and wants, building something solid together. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. They dressed in their best clothes, Dalton in his dark suit and Sarah in her new blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes. She had fashioned a small bouquet from dried flowers and pine boughs, and she carried it nervously as they rode into town. The church was fuller than Dalton had expected. Word had spread about the wedding, and it seemed half the territory had turned out to witness it. Hiram Tucker was there with his wife, a plump, cheerful woman who immediately took Sarah under her wing. Several ranchers Dalton knew nodded their approval. Even the saloon owner and the town doctor had come, curious to meet the woman who had finally captured Dalton Wade's heart. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. Dalton and Sarah stood before Reverend Miller and exchanged vows, their voices steady and clear. When Dalton slipped a simple gold band onto Sarah's finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and was the only piece of jewelry he owned, she smiled up at him with such love that he felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller intoned. "You may kiss your bride." Dalton cupped Sarah's face in his hands and kissed her gently, mindful of their audience but unable to completely hide the depth of his feelings. When they turned to face the congregation, hand in hand, the small church erupted in applause and well wishes. The community insisted on throwing them a celebration at the hotel. Tables were pushed together, food appeared as if by magic, and someone produced a fiddle. Dalton found himself swept into conversation after conversation, accepting congratulations and advice, some of it useful, some of it less so. But through it all, he kept Sarah close, his hand at her waist or holding hers, grounding himself in her presence. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration showed no signs of ending, Sarah leaned close to Dalton and whispered, "Can we go home now? I want to be alone with my husband." The way she said husband, with such warmth and promise, sent a thrill through him. He nodded and they made their excuses, thanking everyone for coming and for their generosity. The ride back to the ranch was made in comfortable silence, both of them tired but happy, anticipating the night ahead. Inside the cabin, Dalton built up the fire while Sarah changed out of her wedding dress into something more comfortable. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen he had erected for her, wearing one of his shirts over her nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, he thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Come here," he said softly, and she crossed to him, letting him pull her into his arms. They stood there swaying slightly, as if to music only they could hear. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Happier than I have ever been," she replied honestly. "When I think about where I was just 3 weeks ago, lost in that storm, certain I was going to die, and where I am now, married to a good man with a home and a future, it seems like a miracle." "You are my miracle," Dalton said. "The storm brought you to me, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life." They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that felt like both a discovery and a homecoming. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Sarah traced patterns on Dalton's chest and talked about her dreams for their future. "I want children," she said. "At least 3 or 4. I want this cabin to be full of laughter and noise and love." "I want that too," Dalton agreed. "Though we might need to build an addition if we are going to have that many," she laughed, the sound rich and full of joy. "We will figure it out, together." "Together," he echoed, kissing the top of her head. "I like the sound of that." Winter gradually released its grip on Montana territory as February turned to March and then April. The snow melted, revealing the brown grass beneath, and the first signs of spring began to appear. Dalton spent long days repairing fences and checking on his cattle, which had survived the winter better than he had hoped. Sarah worked on preparing the ground for her garden, turning soil and planning what to plant where. They developed routines and rhythms, learning to live together, to navigate the small irritations and adjustments that came with marriage. Dalton discovered that Sarah was not a morning person and needed coffee before she could engage in meaningful conversation. Sarah learned that Dalton needed time alone occasionally, that after days of hard physical labor, he sometimes retreated into silence, not because he was angry or upset, but because he needed to process his thoughts internally. But the love between them continued to grow, deepening into something solid and enduring. They learned each other's bodies, what brought pleasure, what sparked desire. They learned to argue constructively, to express frustration without cruelty, to apologize and forgive. They learned to laugh together, to find humor in the small mishaps of daily life, to not take themselves too seriously. In late April, Sarah missed her monthly courses. She waited another week before saying anything to Dalton, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely. But when a second week passed and still nothing, she could no longer keep the news to herself. "I think I might be with child," she told him one evening as they were cleaning up after dinner. Dalton froze, the dish he was drying forgotten in his hands. "Truly, I cannot be certain yet, but all the signs are there." She placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "We might be parents by the end of the year." A slow smile spread across Dalton's face, transforming it from merely handsome to absolutely radiant. He set down the dish and crossed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it," he replied. "Terrified, yes. Excited, absolutely. But mostly just grateful. Grateful for you, for this life we are building, for the family we are starting." By May, there was no doubt. Sarah's body began to change, her breasts becoming tender, her belly starting to swell ever so slightly. She tired more easily, but remained determined to keep up with her share of the work. Dalton watched her like a hawk, ready to swoop in and take over if he thought she was overdoing it, which sometimes irritated her and sometimes touched her, depending on her mood. They made another trip to Julian in June, this time to see the doctor and purchase supplies they would need for the birth. Dr. Harrison examined Sarah and pronounced her healthy and progressing well. He estimated the baby would arrive in late December or early January, a winter baby. "You will want to stock up well before the birth," the doctor advised. "Make sure you have plenty of wood cut and food stored. Montana winters are unpredictable, and you do not want to be caught short if a storm hits around her due date." "I will make sure we are prepared," Dalton promised. Throughout the summer, Dalton worked harder than he ever had, determined to ensure they had everything they needed before winter arrived. He hired 2 ranch hands to help with the heavier work, young men from town who were glad for the employment. Together they built an addition onto the cabin, adding 2 more rooms, one that would serve as a bedroom for them and one that would be the nursery. They reinforced the barn, stocked the larder to overflowing, and cut enough firewood to last through 2 winters if necessary. Sarah, despite her growing belly, maintained her garden with fierce pride. She harvested vegetables throughout the summer and spent hours canning and preserving food for the winter months. She sewed baby clothes from soft fabric, creating tiny gowns and blankets and caps. She prepared the nursery with loving care, painting the walls a cheerful yellow and hanging curtains she had embroidered with wildflowers. In the evenings, they would sit together in the main room, Dalton often with his hand on Sarah's swollen belly, feeling their child move and kick. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about their hopes and dreams for this new life they had created. "What if something goes wrong?" Sarah asked one night in late October, giving voice to the fear that had been growing as her due date approached. "Women die in childbirth. Babies die. What if?" "Do not think like that," Dalton said firmly, though he shared her fears. He had heard the stories, knew the risks. "You are strong and healthy. Dr. Harrison said everything looks good. We are going to get through this together." "Promise me something," Sarah said, looking up at him with serious eyes. "If something happens and you have to choose the baby. Save our child." "Sarah, no, I cannot promise that. Please, Dalton, promise me." He wanted to refuse, wanted to tell her that he would choose her every time, that he could not imagine continuing without her. But he also understood what she was asking, the sacrifice a mother makes even before her child is born. "I promise," he finally said, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. "But it will not come to that. You are both going to be fine." The first snow fell in mid-November, a light dusting that melted by afternoon. But it was a reminder that winter was coming, and with it, the birth of their child. Dalton made sure everything was ready, double and triple checking their supplies, ensuring they had everything Dr. Harrison had told them they would need. Sarah's labor began on a cold December night, 3 weeks before Christmas. Dalton had been asleep when she shook him awake, her face calm but determined. "It is time," she said simply. He was up and dressed in seconds, his heart pounding. He built up the fire, heated water, and laid out the supplies they had prepared. One of the ranch hands rode into town to fetch Dr. Harrison, though Dalton was not sure the man would make it in time. Sarah's pains were coming quickly, much faster than either of them had expected. Dalton stayed with her throughout the long night, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her when the pain became almost unbearable. He had never felt so helpless, so inadequate. This was women's work, the mysterious and dangerous process of bringing new life into the world, and all he could do was stand by and offer what comfort he could. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Harrison finally arrived, his medical bag in hand. He examined Sarah and nodded approvingly. "You are doing well, Mrs. Wade. Not much longer now." And indeed, as the sun rose fully over the Montana landscape, painting the snow-covered ranch in shades of gold and pink, Sarah gave one final push, and their son entered the world with a lusty cry that was the most beautiful sound Dalton had ever heard. "A boy," Dr. Harrison announced, cutting the cord and wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "A healthy, strong boy." Dalton looked down at his son, at the tiny red face and waving fists, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This was his child, his son, a part of him and Sarah combined into this perfect, miraculous new being. When the doctor placed the baby in Sarah's arms, and Dalton saw the look of pure love on her face, he had to turn away for a moment to compose himself. "He is perfect," Sarah whispered, tracing her finger along the baby's cheek. "Absolutely perfect. What will you name him?" Dr. Harrison asked as he worked to make Sarah comfortable and ensure she had no complications. Dalton and Sarah looked at each other. They had discussed names endlessly but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, the answer seemed obvious. "Daniel," Sarah said. "Daniel Thomas Wade, after Dalton's father." "Thomas?" Dalton questioned, surprised. "It means twin," Sarah explained. "I want him to carry part of your name, too. Daniel Thomas. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Dalton said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like him, just like you." The weeks following Daniel's birth were some of the most challenging and rewarding of their lives. The baby was healthy and growing, but he needed constant attention. Sarah was exhausted. still recovering from the birth, and Dalton found himself taking on tasks he never imagined he would, changing soiled cloths, walking the floor with a crying infant, learning to soothe and comfort this tiny person who depended on them for everything. But through the exhaustion and the overwhelming responsibility, there was also profound joy. Watching Sarah nurse their son, seeing her face soften with love as she cradled him, made Dalton's heart ache with happiness. Holding Daniel while Sarah slept, feeling the weight of his son in his arms, the trust implicit in that small body relaxing against his chest, gave his life a meaning and purpose deeper than anything he had known before. Christmas that year was quiet but special. They did not have money for elaborate gifts, but Dalton carved a set of wooden animals for Daniel, even though the baby was too young to appreciate them. Sarah knitted Dalton a new sweater from wool she had traded for in town. They attended Christmas Eve service at the church in Julian, bundling Daniel in warm blankets for the journey, and received warm congratulations from the community. As the year turned from 1883 to 1884, Dalton reflected on how much his life had changed in the span of 12 months. A year ago, he had been alone, convinced his life would continue in solitary routine until old age or accident claimed him. Now he had a wife he loved more than he had thought possible, a son who made him want to be a better man, and a home filled with warmth and laughter and purpose. The years that followed brought their share of challenges. Ranching was never easy, and Montana's harsh climate was unforgiving. There were seasons when the cattle prices were so low that Dalton wondered if they would make it through. There was a summer of drought that turned the grass brown and made feed scarce. There was another terrible blizzard, though this time Dalton was prepared, with his family safe inside their sturdy cabin. But there were also moments of transcendent joy. Daniel's first steps, taken on unsteady legs across the kitchen floor into Sarah's waiting arms. The arrival of their second child, a daughter they named Sophia Rose, in the spring of 1886. The expansion of their herd, the slow but steady growth of their prosperity. The deepening of the bond between Dalton and Sarah. The way they learned to move through life as one unit, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other through difficulties, celebrating each other's victories. In 1888, their third child was born, another son they named Samuel. The cabin, despite its addition, was now bursting at the seams with life and noise and the organized chaos that comes with 3 young children. Dalton built yet another room, and they talked about eventually constructing a proper house, something bigger and more substantial. Through it all, Dalton never forgot that February morning when he found Sarah half frozen in the snow. He thought about it often, about how easily he could have missed her, how she could have died out there alone. The randomness of it, the sheer luck that had brought them together, never ceased to amaze him. Sometimes he would look at his wife, at the strong, capable woman she had become, at the family they had built together, and feel overwhelmed with gratitude. Sarah, for her part, had made peace with her past. She had written to her cousin in Virginia City shortly after the wedding, explaining what had happened. Her cousin had written back expressing relief that Sarah was alive and well, and wishing her happiness in her new life. They exchanged letters occasionally, and Sarah felt the thread of connection to her old life even as she embraced her new one. She thought often about the people who had died in the stage accident, the ones she had been unable to save. But she had taken Dalton's words to heart and tried to honor their memory by living fully, by not wasting the chance she had been given. She threw herself into her roles as wife and mother with dedication and joy, finding satisfaction in the daily rhythms of domestic life, in nurturing her children and supporting her husband. By 1890, The Wade Ranch was well established and prosperous. Dalton had built a reputation for fair dealing and quality cattle. Other ranchers sought his advice, and he was respected throughout the territory. Sarah had become known for her beautiful garden and her skill at preserving food. Other ranch wives would come to her for advice, and she welcomed them warmly, happy to share what she had learned. Their children were growing. Daniel, at 6, was already showing signs of becoming a capable horseman and a hard worker like his father. Sophia, at 4, was fearless and curious, constantly getting into mischief and charming her way out of trouble. Samuel, at 2, was still finding his personality, but showed signs of being the most thoughtful and gentle of the three. That fall, Sarah suspected she might be pregnant again. When Dr. Harrison confirmed it, she was both excited and nervous. 4 children would stretch their resources, both financial and emotional. But when she told Dalton, his face lit up with such joy that her concerns faded. 4 children, he said wonderingly. We are going to need to build that new house sooner rather than later. Are you sure we can afford it? Sarah asked. We will find a way, Dalton assured her. We always do. True to his word, Dalton began planning the new house that winter. It would be larger, with enough bedrooms for their growing family, a proper kitchen for Sarah, and a parlor where they could entertain guests. He spent months working on the design, consulting with builders in Julian, ordering materials. Their 4th child, another daughter they named Isabel Grace, was born in June of 1891, right as construction was beginning on the new house. The timing was chaotic, but they managed. Sarah recovered more quickly from this birth than the others, perhaps because she was more experienced now, more confident in her body's ability to do what it needed to do. The house was completed in September, just before the first frost. It was beautiful, a 2-story structure with a wide front porch and large windows that let in abundant light. Moving in felt like a milestone, a physical manifestation of how far they had come. The night of the move, after the children were finally settled and asleep in their new bedrooms, Dalton and Sarah stood together on the front porch, looking out at their land. The setting sun painted everything in shades of orange and gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of autumn. Do you ever regret it? Dalton asked, his arm around Sarah's waist. Staying here instead of going to Virginia City. Sometimes I wonder if you think about the life you might have had. Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes warm with love. I do not regret a single thing, she said firmly. That blizzard that almost killed me brought me to you, to this life, to our children. I would not change any of it, not even the hard parts. This is where I was meant to be. You are who I was meant to find. You are home now, Dalton said, echoing the words he had spoken to her so many years ago when she first woke up in his cabin. I am home, Sarah agreed. I have been from the moment you found me. They stood there together as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, comfortable in the silence, secure in their love, grateful for the life they had built from what had begun as a desperate rescue in a Montana blizzard. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. The children grew, each developing their own distinct personalities and interests. Daniel, true to early predictions, became an excellent horseman and took on more responsibility around the ranch as he grew older. Sophia surprised everyone by showing a keen head for numbers and began helping Sarah with the household accounts. Samuel proved to have a gift with animals, able to calm even the most skittish horse or cow with his quiet presence. Isabel, as the youngest, was perhaps the most spoiled, but also the most observant, watching everything and everyone with her father's blue eyes. In 1895, Montana became a state, and the event was celebrated throughout the territory. Dalton and Sarah took the children to Helena for the statehood celebration, their first real family trip. The children were awed by the city, by the crowds and buildings and the general bustle of urban life so different from their ranch. But after a few days, they were all ready to go home, missing the wide open spaces and the quiet of their land. As Daniel approached his teenage years, Dalton began seriously teaching him the business of ranching, taking him along on cattle drives, showing him how to assess the quality of livestock, explaining the economics of buying and selling. Daniel absorbed it all eagerly, proud to be trusted with grown-up responsibilities. Sarah, watching her oldest son grow into a young man, felt the bittersweet passage of time. Her children would not be young forever. Soon enough they would be grown, making their own ways in the world. But she tried not to dwell on the future, instead focusing on appreciating each day, each stage of their development. In 1898, when Spanish-American War broke out, there was much discussion about it in Julian and throughout Montana. Dalton was grateful his sons were still too young to be called to service, though he wondered what the world would look like by the time they were grown. The country was changing rapidly, modernizing in ways that were both exciting and unsettling. The ranch continued to prosper throughout the decade. Dalton had expanded their operations considerably, and they now employed several full-time ranch hands. The new house had proven to be a wise investment, comfortable and spacious enough for their family and the occasional guest. Sarah had established herself as a pillar of the community, known for her generosity and wisdom. Women came to her for advice on everything from child rearing to marriage to managing household finances. As the century drew to a close, Dalton and Sarah found themselves reflecting on the 17 years they had been together. They were no longer young. Dalton was approaching 40, his dark hair now threaded with gray at the temples. Sarah was in her late 30s, her face showing the lines that come from a life fully lived, from laughter and worry and the constant work of raising children. But to each other, they were as beautiful as they had been on their wedding day. One evening in December of 1899, as they prepared to celebrate the turn of the century, Sarah and Dalton found a rare moment alone. The children were all in bed, the house was quiet, and they sat together by the fire in their bedroom, hands clasped. 17 years ago, I was lost in a blizzard, certain I was going to die, Sarah said softly. I remember the cold, the way it seeped into my bones. I remember falling in the snow and not being able to get up, just accepting that this was the end. Thank God I found you, Dalton said, squeezing her hand. Thank God you did not ride past, Sarah agreed. My entire life, everything I am, everything we have built, it all flows from that moment, from your choice to stop, to look closer, to see me in the snow. It was not really a choice, Dalton said. How could I have done anything else? Many men would have, Sarah replied. Many men would have been focused only on getting themselves to safety, but you stopped. You risked your own life to save a stranger. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. I am just a man who got lucky, Dalton said. Lucky that a blizzard brought the most remarkable woman I have ever known into my life. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, each lost in their own thoughts but connected by their joined hands and their shared history. What do you think the new century will bring? Sarah asked eventually. Change, Dalton said. That is one thing we can count on. The world is different now than when we met. It will be even more different in another 17 years. As long as we face it together, I am not afraid, Sarah said. Together, Dalton agreed. Always together. The new century did indeed bring changes. Automobiles began appearing on the streets of Montana's cities, though they were still rare curiosities in rural areas like Julian. Electricity reached some of the larger towns, though the ranch still relied on kerosene lamps and candles. Telephones became more common, though the Wade Ranch would not get a line until 1905. The children continued to grow and develop. Daniel, at 17 in 1901, had become a capable young man, taking on more and more responsibility around the ranch. Dalton began to think about the future, about how the ranch would pass to his children when he was gone. He wanted to ensure it remained intact, a legacy for all of them. Sophia, at 15, had become a beautiful young woman with her mother's dark hair and green eyes and her father's quiet determination. She had been courted by several young men from neighboring ranches, but none had captured her interest yet. Sarah saw something of herself in her daughter, that same independence and desire for something more than just the conventional path. Samuel, at 13, was quieter than his siblings but no less intelligent. He had developed a real gift for handling livestock and spent hours working with the horses, training them with patience and skill. Dalton thought he might become a horse breeder if that was what interested him. Isabel, at 10, was still the baby of the family, though she hated being called that. She was curious about everything, constantly asking questions, wanting to understand how the world worked. Sarah thought she might make a good teacher someday if she chose to pursue that path. In the spring of 1903, tragedy struck when one of their longtime ranch hands, a man named Pete Johnson who had been with them for nearly a decade, was killed in a riding accident. His horse had spooked and thrown him, and he had struck his head on a rock. The entire community mourned his loss, and the Wade family felt it deeply. Pete had been more than just an employee. He had been a friend, a presence at their dinner table on countless occasions, a man who had taught Daniel much of what he knew about cattle herding. The funeral was held at the church in Julian, and it seemed the entire county turned out to pay their respects. Afterward, as they were leaving the cemetery, Sarah overheard two older women talking. "Those Wade children are so well-mannered," one said. "Sarah has done a wonderful job raising them. And Dalton has built that ranch into something really successful," the other replied. "Remember when he was just a bachelor struggling to keep his head above water? Hard to believe how much has changed." Sarah smiled to herself, thinking about how different their lives were now from those early days. But the foundation remained the same, the love she and Dalton shared, the commitment they had made to each other and to their family. That evening, back at the ranch, the family gathered for dinner as they always did. It was a noisy affair, with the children talking over each other, sharing stories from their day, arguing good-naturedly about everything from politics to whether it would rain tomorrow. Dalton sat at the head of the table, Sarah at the foot, and they exchanged glances throughout the meal. Those silent conversations that long married couples develop, saying everything without words. After the children had gone to bed, Dalton and Sarah took a walk around their property, something they tried to do regularly when weather permitted. The spring evening was mild, with a hint of warmth that promised summer was not far off. They walked hand in hand, pointing out things that needed attention, discussing plans for the coming months, comfortable in the rhythm of their partnership. "Daniel is almost a man now," Dalton observed. "In another year or two, he will probably want to start courting seriously, thinking about marriage." "I know," Sarah said. "It seems impossible that our baby is grown. Where did the time go?" "It went into building a life," Dalton replied. "Into raising good children. Into creating something that will outlast us." "Do you ever wish we had done things differently?" Sarah asked. "Never," Dalton said without hesitation. "Do you?" Not for a moment, Sarah assured him. Every choice we made, even the difficult ones, led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be. In 1905, Daniel announced his intention to marry a young woman named Catherine Miller, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. The wedding was a grand affair by Julian standards, held in late summer when the weather was most reliable. Dalton and Sarah watched their eldest son exchange vows, and both felt the profound mix of pride and melancholy that comes with watching your child begin their own adult life. Daniel and Catherine built a small house on the ranch property, and Daniel continued working alongside his father, now with increased authority as he began to take over more of the day-to-day management. Catherine fit into the family beautifully, and Sarah was grateful to have another woman around to share the domestic workload and provide companionship. In 1906, Catherine gave birth to a son, making Dalton and Sarah grandparents for the first time. They named him Thomas Dalton Wade, continuing the family tradition, and the baby was welcomed with great joy. Holding his grandson, Dalton felt the cycle of life continuing, the legacy he and Sarah had started extending into another generation. Sophia married in 1907 to a young lawyer from Helena named Robert Anderson. Unlike her brother, Sophia chose to move away from the ranch, settling in the city where her husband practiced law. Sarah missed her daughter terribly, but understood Sophia's desire to experience a different kind of life. They wrote letters frequently, and Sophia visited as often as she could. Samuel showed no interest in courting, instead focusing all his energy on developing the ranch's horse breeding operation. He had a real gift for it, and the horses he raised became known throughout Montana for their quality and temperament. Dalton gave him a corner of the ranch to develop as he saw fit, and Samuel threw himself into the work with dedication and passion. Isabel, as she grew into young womanhood, revealed herself to be perhaps the most like Sarah in temperament. She was fiercely independent, curious about the world beyond Montana, and determined to make her own way. She talked about going to college, something practically unheard of for ranch girls, but Dalton and Sarah encouraged her ambitions. They had worked hard to ensure their children would have opportunities they themselves had never had. By 1910, the Wade Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the region. Dalton had expanded into horse breeding alongside the cattle operation, thanks largely to Samuel's efforts. They employed a dozen men full-time and more during busy seasons. The ranch provided not just for their immediate family, but for many others in the community as well. But success had not changed the essential nature of who Dalton and Sarah were. They remained grounded, hardworking, committed to their family and their community. They still attended church every Sunday when weather permitted. Sarah still maintained her garden, though it was now largely tended by Isabel and Catherine. Dalton still rose before dawn to check on the livestock, though Daniel now handled many of those duties. On a cold February morning in 1911, 28 years to the day after Dalton had found Sarah in the snow, they woke early and lay together in bed, watching the winter sunrise paint the sky outside their window. 28 years, Sarah said softly. Can you believe it has been that long? It feels like both forever and no time at all, Dalton replied. Sometimes I look at you and I still see the woman I pulled from the snow, young and frightened but so brave. Other times I cannot remember what life was like before you. We have had a good life, Sarah said, better than I ever dreamed possible when I was dying in that blizzard. We have, Dalton agreed. 4 children, all grown or nearly so, 2 grandchildren now with more surely coming. The ranch is prosperous. We have our health, we have each other. What more could anyone ask for? Nothing, Sarah said firmly. Absolutely nothing. We have everything that matters." They rose and went about their day, but both carried with them a sense of gratitude for the path their lives had taken, for the choices made, and the luck that had brought them together. The years continued their steady march. Sophia had 2 children, a daughter and a son, bringing Dalton and Sarah's grandchild count to 4. Catherine had another baby, this time a daughter. Samuel finally courted and married a quiet woman named Jane who shared his love of horses. They built a house near Samuel's breeding operation and began their own family. Isabel, true to her word, went to college in Missoula, studying to become a teacher. She was the first in the family to receive higher education, and both Dalton and Sarah beamed with pride at her graduation in 1912. As Dalton entered his 50s, he began to slow down, not drastically but noticeably. The years of hard physical labor were taking their toll. He turned over more of the ranch operations to Daniel, content to take on an advisory role. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride, telling them stories about the old days when Montana was still a territory, and life was harder but perhaps simpler. Sarah, too, found herself drawn more to domestic pursuits and less to the demanding physical work of earlier years. She focused on her relationships, on maintaining connections with her children and grandchildren, on being a source of wisdom and comfort for the younger generation. She and Catherine became close, almost like mother and daughter, and Sarah was grateful for the relationship. In 1915, the world seemed to be going mad. War raged in Europe, and though America was not yet involved, everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The news that filtered back from the battlefields was horrific, stories of modern warfare's terrible toll. Dalton was profoundly grateful that his sons were both too old for conscription if America entered the war, and his grandsons too young. But he worried about the world his grandchildren would inherit. That spring, Dalton fell ill with pneumonia. For several terrifying weeks, Sarah thought she might lose him. The doctor came regularly, and the entire family gathered, praying and hoping. But Dalton's constitution was strong, strengthened by decades of outdoor work and clean living, and he slowly recovered, though it took months before he was fully back to himself. The illness changed something in both of them. They had always known intellectually that they would not live forever, but now they felt the reality of their mortality in a more immediate way. They began to talk more seriously about the future, about what would happen to the ranch after they were gone, about how to ensure the family remained united. Dalton had a will drawn up, with the ranch divided equally among the 4 children. Sarah made sure her own affairs were in order as well. They talked to the children about their wishes, about wanting the ranch to remain in the family, to continue to be a source of livelihood and pride for future generations. By 1917, when America finally entered the Great War, Dalton was 57 and Sarah 55. They had been married for 34 years together through all that time, partners in every sense of the word. They had weathered storms literal and figurative, had raised 4 children, had built something substantial and lasting. Sitting together on the porch of their house one warm summer evening, watching the sun set over their land, Sarah leaned her head on Dalton's shoulder. "If I could go back to that moment in the snow," she said thoughtfully, "to when I thought I was dying and somehow know that I would be saved, that I would have all of this, I do not think I would have believed it. It would have seemed too good to be true." "Life has a way of surprising us," Dalton said. "I certainly never imagined that morning when I found you that I was finding my wife, the mother of my children, my partner for life. I thought I was just helping someone in trouble." "You were," Sarah said. "But you were also giving me a gift beyond measure. You gave me a future when I had none. You gave me a home when I was lost. You gave me love when I was alone. Everything I am, everything I have become started with your kindness that day. And you gave me just as much, Dalton countered. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You brought life to this place, joy, purpose. You made a house into a home. You gave me children, a family. You made me happier than I ever thought possible. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had shone down on them that night so many years ago when Sarah had agreed to marry him, when Dalton had promised her that she was home. The war ended in 1918, and the family celebrated, grateful that none of their own had been lost to that terrible conflict. The world that emerged from the war was different, changed in ways both visible and subtle. But the ranch remained, a constant in a changing world, and the family that had built it continued to grow and thrive. In 1920, as the decade turned and the country entered what would come to be known as the Roaring Twenties, Dalton and Sarah celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary quietly, just the two of them. The children had offered to throw a party, but they had declined, preferring to mark the occasion privately. They took a walk around the ranch, as they had so many times before, but this time it was less about checking fences or planning work and more about remembering. They stopped at the place where the old cabin had stood, now just a foundation overgrown with grass. They remembered their early days there, the cramped quarters, the struggle to make ends meet, the joy of their first child. They walked to the new cemetery on the property, where Pete Johnson and several others who had worked on the ranch over the years were buried. They paid their respects, remembering friends lost to time and accident. They visited the various houses on the property, checking in briefly with Daniel and Catherine, with Samuel and Jane, seeing their grandchildren who were growing so fast. Finally, they returned to their own house as evening fell. Inside, Sarah prepared a simple meal and they ate together at the kitchen table, talking and laughing, reminiscing about their years together. "You remember our wedding night?" Sarah asked, a playful smile on her lips. "You were so nervous." "I was terrified," Dalton admitted. "I wanted everything to be perfect for you, and I was convinced I would somehow mess it up." "You did not mess anything up," Sarah assured him. "It was perfect because we were together. That is all that mattered then and all that matters now." After dinner, they sat together in the parlor, Sarah reading while Dalton worked on a piece of leather he was tooling, a hobby he had taken up in his later years. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking the passage of time that seemed to move both too fast and exactly right. "Dalton," Sarah said suddenly, setting down her book. "Yes, thank you for what? For everything. For finding me, for loving me, for giving me this life, for being exactly who you are." Dalton set down his work and crossed to her, kneeling beside her chair despite the protest of his joints. He took her hands in his, looking into those green eyes that still captivated him after all these years. "You never need to thank me," he said. "Loving you has been the easiest thing I have ever done. You are my heart, Sarah. You always have been." She leaned down and kissed him, tender and sweet, a kiss that held decades of love and commitment and partnership. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Come on," Dalton said, standing and offering her his hand. "Let us go to bed. I want to fall asleep holding you like I have for 37 years. And wake up beside you like I hope to for many more years to come," Sarah added, taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. They climbed the stairs to their bedroom, moving more slowly than they once had but still together, still hand in hand. In their room, they prepared for bed with the comfortable routine of long marriage, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask. Lying in bed together, Sarah curled into Dalton's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. She listened to the steady beat of his heart, that sound that had comforted her through so many nights, and felt completely at peace. "You are home now," Dalton murmured, repeating the words he had spoken all those years ago. "I am home," Sarah agreed. "I always have been from the moment you found me." And as they drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the life they had built together, the family they had created, the love they had nurtured through decades, both knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they had faced everything else together. Two souls bound by fate and choice, by chance and determination, by a blizzard in the Montana wilderness, and the simple human kindness of a man who could not ride past someone in need. Their story, born from near tragedy and blooming into a life rich with love and purpose, was one they would carry with them always, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of commitment, and the enduring nature of true love. From that desperate moment in the snow to this peaceful evening in their comfortable bed, from strangers to lovers to partners to grandparents, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, in their children and grandchildren, and in the very land itself, forever marked by their presence and their love.